Interesting day, interesting week. And I was in here listening to the colloquy between our Majority Leader McCarthy and the Minority Whip, and I'd heard my good friend, very intelligent, clever, witty friend from Maryland, Mr. Hoyer, indicate that Republicans bring us to the brink time and time again, talking about, I guess, the debt ceiling. And sometimes it's just good to stop from the rhetoric here and the lines like bringing us to the brink. And it's really good to look at what the history of the situation is. Because, you know, for 40 years, until Newt Gingrich led with a contract with America, Republicans recaptured the majority in the House and Senate for the first time in 40 years, the Democrats kept bringing us to the brink. Didn't matter who was in the White House, the Democratic Congress kept bringing us to the brink, spending more and more money. And we thought it was a great deal of money. It kept bringing us to the brink. It seemed so irresponsible not to be interested in trying to have a more balanced budget. There'd be people like Phil Gramm, push the Gramm-Rudman law that tried to force a balancing. And in fact, I know the president will probably, in weeks to come, continue the mistaken rhetoric. He's such a nice guy, but he is so often mistaken, or whoever puts those mistakes in his teleprompter. But the fact is that repeatedly, this requirement that Congress raise the debt ceiling if more debt is to be incurred has been used as a vehicle to get laws passed that tried to rein in the irresponsible spending that's been going on for many decades. And as I believe as Morgenthau, the Franklin Roosevelt Secretary of Treasury, wrote in 1940, after 8 years, we've spent more money than anyone ever in history, and we have nothing to show for it but more debt. That was quite an admission that the New Deal was a total failure, but it actually was. And it wasn't until World War II actually ended the Depression in America that we came out of the Great Depression. It was certainly none of the socialist policies that the United States began engaging in. But I know just since I've been here in January of 2005, 2006, as I recall, we were having debate. Republicans were in the majority. And my friends, Mr. Speaker, on the Democratic side of the room over here were repeatedly making the point about how irresponsible it was for Republicans to be spending, I think at the time it was around $160 billion more than we were bringing into the federal treasury. And I agreed, actually, we should have balanced the budget back in 05 and 06. We were only $160 billion at one point away from doing that. And I think that was part of the reason the Democrats continued beating up on Republicans for overspending what was coming in, and $160 billion or so. Little would I ever dream that after being pummeled verbally by friends as a Republican spending $160 billion more or so than we had coming in, that those same friends would do the unthinkable and increase that debt in 1 year more than 10 times the $160 billion. You would have thought that perhaps they would remember some of those things they used to say with such vitriol right here on the House floor about how spending more than $160 billion more than we were taking in was so irresponsible. You would have thought they might have remembered some of those, because when you say one thing one year and then you get the majority and you're 10 times worse than what you accuse the other side of, more than 10 times worse, some people feel a little sensitive for, and we have to be careful because we certainly don't want to violate the House rules by what we say here, but, you know, some people feel guilty when they accuse somebody else of doing something they're 10 times more guilty of. But apparently that guilt didn't exist, or if it did, it was short-lived and didn't prevent even my friend from Maryland from coming to the floor today and again launching the inappropriate statement that it's Republicans that keep bringing us to the brink. And I realize that it was our own speaker that went on the Jay Leno show and said that Republicans shut down the government. But, you know, sometimes he's engaged in activity that keep him from realizing exactly what's going on. But if you go back and look at the actual record, September 29th, September 30th of 2013, the record is very clear. There was one party in Congress that was trying to be responsible, that was trying to rein in spending, that was trying not to shut the government down, was compromising against ourselves repeatedly, and it was the Republican Party. And we didn't get a lot of help across the aisle. And in fact, what we had from the other end of the hall here, from the Majority Leader Reid, was an all-out effort to shut down the government. And that is a fact as to who shut down the government. Because if anyone bothers to go look, yes, you'll see we had a spending bill that gave Harry Reid everything he and the president wanted, plus some. Hard for a guy like me to vote for that, but yes, in the initial bill, we defunded Obamacare. Why wouldn't we? We know. We hear from constituents how bad that is, how they've lost their insurance, lost their doctor. They can't get the medicine they did before. Instead of paying $10, now they're paying $100 per prescription. We're hearing all those things. So why wouldn't we vote to do what we believe is best for our constituents? We did. Voted to fund everything they wanted, plus some, but defund Obamacare. Yes, that is what we passed first. And Harry Reid would not bring it to the floor for a vote. And so we compromised against ourselves because there was no negotiating. Because I believe, and Mr. Speaker, this is just my thought, but it sure seemed there was plenty of evidence to show that Harry Reid believed the wisdom here in Washington that if there were a shutdown of the government, no matter who did it, no matter that the Democrats themselves did everything they could to shut the government down, it wouldn't matter because their friends in the mainstream media would blame the Republicans. Who knew we'd have a Republican speaker that didn't know the fact and would say, yeah, Republicans shut it down. But they knew the mainstream media would blame Republicans, and they needed a shutdown because the conventional wisdom here in Washington at the time still is, if there's a shutdown, then mainstream media blames Republicans, and then the Democrats get the majority back in the House, or if they didn't have it, as they don't have it now, they get it back in the Senate. So they have been wanting a shutdown. You can go back to, I think, March of 2011. Harry Reid would not yield at all when we got down to a midnight deadline, and our speaker came in and basically caved just a few months after we took the majority in March of 2011 and said we got to avoid a shutdown at all costs. And so around 10:30, 11, Republicans completely caved and gave Harry Reid what he wanted because he wanted a shutdown. You could say that's bringing us to the brink for political purposes. And that's exactly what it is. So we came back and we bet against ourselves. We passed a bill that gave Harry Reid everything he and the president wanted, plus some, but we put in a provision, not the complete defunding of Obamacare, but just suspending it for a year. And I frankly thought that because there were Democrats on the ropes in the Senate, that if they wouldn't even vote on that or voted against it, they would lose their seats. And I bet you could find some senators who lost their seats in that next election that wish they had taken that vote and voted to postpone Obamacare for a year. They probably would have kept their seats. But they didn't. They didn't even get to vote on that bill on the Senate floor. I thought it was unwise, having negotiated big deals back in Texas. I thought it was unwise to bid against ourselves yet again when the Senate would not even engage in any kind of compromise. They wanted a shutdown. But no, we had another vote. We said, okay, we'll give you, Harry Reid, we'll give you everything you want, President Obama, everything you want, plus a little bit. But since the president suspended the employer mandate illegally, unconstitutionally for a year, how about if we suspend the individual mandate for a year? That was not allowed to come to the floor for a vote. Even though we were doing everything we could to keep the government going, Harry Reid wanted a shutdown, would not allow a vote, and I thought at 1:10 a.m., when our leadership came here to the floor on October 1st, 1:10 a.m., and asked us to vote for folks to be conferees that would work all night and avoid a shutdown by 8 a.m., capitulate where they have to, but get a deal done, that it was really capitulation, and that Harry Reid would be crazy not to go ahead and appoint Senate committees so they could have a deal by 8 a.m. The country would never realize there was even an 8-hour shutdown. But Harry Reid would not even allow the Senate to vote to have conferees to work out a deal by 8 a.m. He didn't. So Harry Reid forced the shutdown, no doubt with the encouragement of the president, and sure enough, the mainstream media blamed Republicans, and that cost Republicans tremendously in the election the following year. Oh, wait, no, it didn't, actually. The American people actually, I think, ended up appreciating that Republicans were standing for the idea that we are on the brink because of all the decades of overspending, except for that little interlude in the 90s when the Republicans took the majority here in Congress, and part of their contract with America, they became very responsible, and they pushed through budgets that Bill Clinton didn't want to sign but eventually took credit for, that actually brought the budget into alignment. Other than that, Democrats have brought us to the brink repeatedly, and Harry Reid and President Obama continue to do that. So who would have ever dreamed in 2006 that here in 2015 we would have Democrats crowing over the fact that, gee, we may get our deficit in 1 year down to $400 billion, $500 billion. Wow, won't that be great? Because once again, their memories have not allowed them to accuse themselves back during those days when they were blaming Republicans for running up a $160 billion deficit in 1 year. Now, my friend from Maryland also pointed out that Dave Kemp had a tax reform bill, and in his words, it was dismissed out of hand because it was not paid for. And he is my friend Mr. Hoyer is such a smart guy. I admire him. I love talking to him. Got a great sense of humor. But he's just wrong on that. Happens. He's wrong. It was not dismissed out of hand because it was paid for. It was dismissed out of hand because it was not a significant enough reform in the right direction of what we need, a complete simplification of the tax code that so many of us are asking for. I like a flat tax. Others like a fair tax, and I sure can see their points. It's got some good points. But let's have that debate. Throw out the Internal Revenue Code. Throw out the tens of thousands of pages that have been added in interpretation and regulation. And let's have something that Americans can simply fill out easily, not even need an accountant. Something like a flat tax. The more you make, the more you pay. But Dave Camp's tax reform bill is, and I just love the guy. He is a fine American. And we were so thrilled when he was able to beat back the cancer that overtook him. So, great guy, worked hard, but his problem in my estimation, his problem on his tax reform bill was from being as good as I thought it should be and many others. So I appreciate the points being made here on the floor, but I thought it called out for a little elaboration and correction. Now, we also had a hearing yesterday that went on for a number of hours. It was an important hearing, and I know there were people that kept talking about, gee, there have been 7 hearings or 8 hearings, whatever there have been, or 7 or 8 investigations. None of them had the documentation that is now only starting to be obtained from a recalcitrant State Department and Obama administration. Yeah, it's easy to get an okay when you don't turn over the documents that show lie after lie, misrepresentation. Yeah, it's easy. All you do is just don't let anybody see the documentation for the misrepresentations that came. Now, my staff said you got to read this article, and it uses the L word a number of times, the L word being lie. It uses that a number of times, but I don't want to even come close to getting in trouble for violating any rule here on the House floor because the content's too important. So we'll just say instead of lies, we'll just call them unfortunate wrong statements. So with that substitution, and then I found out, gee, it's my friend Ben Shapiro that wrote this. Hope that doesn't hurt Ben that I mentioned we're friends. But anyway, Hillary Clinton's 5 biggest unfortunate mistaken representations in her Benghazi testimony. Down in the article, it points out Hillary is the poor, put-upon victim of a vast right-wing conspiracy. Because, Mr. Speaker, I know you'll remember back in the 90s when her husband was accused of doing things that it turned out he really did, instead of making clear her husband had made mistakes and she had made it clear there would be no more, she went after the women. She had a war on women and went after any women who actually accused her husband of impropriety, and even used and coined that phrase, this vast right-wing conspiracy, during her war on women who just tried to point out what her husband had done to them. But the article says she set up a private email server and deleted relevant emails from it for purely political reasons. She pressed for a pointless invasion of Libya for political reasons, chortled at its conquest for political reasons, watched it descend into chaos while doing nothing for political reasons, and then allowed her ambassador to twist in the Libyan tornado without proper security for political reasons. Finally, she covered up that the disaster covered up that disaster by lying about its causes for political reasons. But those who ask questions about such matters are partisan politicians. The article goes on further down. Hillary kept claiming that she cared deeply about her good friend Chris Stevens. At one point, she whipped out her pre-planned righteous indignation to complain, quote, "I would imagine I thought more about what happened than all of you put together. I've lost more sleep than all of you put together." This was salt in the wound, the equivalent of Johnny Cochran lamenting his worries over the fate of Nicole Brown Simpson. And I've got to inject at this point, I was there for a good bit of the hearing because a friend, a real patriot, she's served in the Navy. It's where she met a guy named Ty Woods, one of the greatest American patriots this country could ever hope to have as a son. She married Ty. They'd even had another child right before, not just months before, he found himself in Benghazi. And another former Navy SEAL, like Ty, that cared more about his country and serving others than his own self-interest, came and joined him. So I understand when Ty was getting ready to go to the roof to try to protect those people, he knew David Ubben with the State Department, former Army Ranger, and David went with him, grabbed an M4. They went to the roof to protect the Americans that were in the building beneath them. I'll never forget reading the name of the first Navy SEAL that this administration released, and the story. Obviously, this language had to come from this administration. It struck me as such a slap in the face to this former Navy SEAL, because I've known so many Navy SEALs and former Navy SEALs, and proud of everyone I've known, well, maybe except for a former governor who's creating chaos for Chris Kyle's widow. But when I read the words after Glenn Doherty, former Navy SEAL, contractor, and it said from the information released from this administration that he died while taking cover. Now, I didn't know anything about Benghazi at that point, about the specifics, but I knew enough Navy SEALs to know if he died, it wasn't taking cover. It was probably giving cover, or maybe moving to get a better vantage from which to defend other people. That's the Navy SEALs I know, generally speaking. And then we find out he didn't die taking cover. Ty Woods didn't die taking cover. I don't know if that was the State Department's release to try to minimize how heroic those people were because they violated orders and said, we're going to help those people that are pinned down in Benghazi. Those are heroes. And I know my friend Duncan Hunter had moved to try to get a Congressional Medal of Honor. I think it's time we take those back up. They deserve, though they weren't in the military, they deserve the highest honor this body could give them posthumously. And David Ubben, I never brought it up during the months that he had after I met him out one of my visits out to Bethesda, or Walter Reed combined with it now. But he was up there on the roof. There were 3 mortars that came in. The first one missed. And having been in the Army 4 years, I know they used to teach us, if there are 3 mortars or 3 artillery rounds coming in, then you better move before the 4th one hits, because they'll use those 3 to triangulate your position, and the 4th one will be on top of your head. So when I heard David say there had been 3 mortars coming, I said, oh, so they bracketed you. And he said, oh, no. I don't want you to get the wrong idea. We knew as soon as the first one missed, they knew exactly where our position was. It was short, but there was no question they knew exactly at what angle to put that mortar so that it would come down on our heads, and that's what 2nd and 3rd mortar did. There was no bracketing. They knew their position, pre-planned attack. They had the coordination perfectly, exactly where that mortar needed to be. The first one was short, as he said, but the 2nd and 3rd were right on top of their targets, and that's what killed Glenn and Ty as they were giving cover, not taking cover, giving cover. And in fact, I heard yesterday, it wasn't in the hearing, wasn't said in the hearing, but I heard from somebody who had talked to a Delta Force individual when he heard the name Ty Woods. He said, you know, that guy, England took on a whole city. They didn't care. They were going to protect the United States civil servants that were in the that they went to the roof of, and they gave their lives giving them cover. David Ubben lost much of his right leg, but after many surgeries, hopefully it's near the point now of being usable. He's a hero. This administration didn't even want to give him the right credit. And then to have them, and Ben Shapiro points it out here, they used this video, and even to say to any one of the survivors, as Ms. Clinton did, we'll get the guy that did the video. They didn't care about the video. I've talked to many of the family members of those who were killed. They didn't care about the guy that did the video. They cared about the people that killed their loved one. Dorothy Woods is a hero. So for Mrs. Clinton to sit there and arrogantly, condescendingly say to the panel, I've lost more sleep than all of you put together, with Dorothy Woods sitting right there, was just another dagger to her heart, because she still loses sleep. And let's go back to that night. We still don't know what Hillary Clinton and our president did specifically after they found out. Either the president was preparing for his fundraiser in Las Vegas the next day, or he just went to bed with his personal ambassador to Libya missing. Either they went to bed or did something far more embarrassing. Be willing to tell us what they did that night. I mean, I was only in the Army 4 years, but I cannot imagine what kind of mind will allow itself to go to sleep or just blow things off and move on to another project when somebody working directly for you has either been killed, you know people have been killed, and the ambassador's missing in a hostile area that turns out begged for security, additional security, 600 times. This is disgraceful. Just disgraceful. It had nothing to do with the video. My friend Jim Jordan said, you tell the American people one thing, you tell your family an entirely different story. And in fact, she told the Egyptian prime minister the day after the attacks, quote, we know the attack in Libya had nothing to do with the film. It was a planned attack, not a protest, unquote. And as I recall, not only was that simply not true. She took State Department funds, as I understand it, and spent tens of thousands of dollars on a commercial to facilitate and to perpetuate this lie, and spent that in foreign Muslim countries, running it on their television to say, we had nothing to do with the video. Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and